At this point, we will be hearing Carole share her reflections and her thoughts. She's asked me to read our scripture for the day. I put it in the bulletin. It's Matthew 12, 1 through 8. And I'm reading from the NRS, the New Revised Standard Version. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath." He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to do, or his companions to eat, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and yet are guiltless? I tell you something, greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." Thank you, Carole.
Thanks, Bob, and good morning. Before Christmas, my brother texted a New York Times article to me titled, "The Forgotten Radicalism of Jesus Christ. First century Christians weren't prepared for what a truly inclusive figure he was, and what was true then is still true today." The author was Peter Weiner, a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a New York Times contributing opinion writer. I liked what Weiner had to say so much that I considered just reading his article to you this morning, but I decided I should take advantage of this opportunity to talk with you about my journey into peace, justice, and nonviolence. I tend to focus more on peace and justice. I can't separate those two ideas. The more I learn about peace and justice, the more I want to understand and live by Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote, "True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice." I also think about what Don Fish said a number of Sundays ago, that the real message of the Bible is equality. To me, equality does not happen without justice and peace. My question for you all to consider as I talk is, what do peace and justice mean for me, for you, and possibly for our Mennonite community's commitment in the Cedar Valley? A number of years ago, Jack, my spouse, and I talked about what we could do to help our broader community. We could see that poverty seemed to be an underlying cause for so many of the problems we knew about. Since I'm a joiner, I accepted an invitation to attend a local NAACP meeting with some people I knew. After asking some pretty dumb questions, I came to understand that listening was the most important thing I could do to learn about peace and justice for the Black community. But it wasn't easy. I had to recognize my white privilege and work at listening. The stories I heard at the NAACP meetings were often pleas for help to right the wrongs of the many racist systems in our community and country, systems that are intentionally racist. Peter Weiner wrote that Jesus ran into similar situations. He wrote, "Jesus was repeatedly attacked for hanging out with the wrong crowd and recruiting his disciples from the lower rungs of society." Weiner gave examples of the stories of Jesus talking to a woman at the well, recruiting Matthew, the tax collector, as a disciple, talking to a Samaritan. Based on those examples, Weiner said Jesus, quote, "understood that we human beings battle with exclusion, self-righteousness, and arrogance, and have a quick trigger finger when it comes to judging others. Jesus knew how easily we could fall into the trap of turning the other, those of other races, ethnicities, classes, genders, and nations, into enemies. We place loyalty to the tribe over compassion and human connection. We view differences as threatening. The result is we become isolated, rigid in our thinking, harsh, and unforgiving," end quote. A person's story can make a big impact when we really listen to it and try to understand. Perhaps that's the biggest lesson for me to take in when I ask, what would we do? At the NAACP meetings, I tried to listen more to hear about a culture than my own and try not to judge. I'm sorry to admit that it was sometimes difficult for me. I was also working to remember that without justice, there is no peace. I agreed to become the branch secretary and had and still have the privilege of working with LaTanya Graves, the branch president. I nominated Latanya to be an unsung hero of the Cedar Valley when Youth Art Team did a project of wooden sculptures featuring people in our community who aren't the first and always ones to be recognized. Latanya's mantra is, I'll help anyone, I don't care what color they are or who they are, and she means it and lives it. When I nominated her, she told me about the time some people were stranded in their car near her house during a snowstorm. She took them in for the night. Would I have done that? Probably not. She has attended so many court hearings and offered advice to so many people trying to get through the criminal justice system. Latanya understands that without justice, there is no peace. Would I do what she's done? Well, I've gone to several court hearings as an NAACP president, so maybe that's a start. She really lives her values to the point that now I often ask myself, what would Jesus do and what would Latanya do? This example and others I'll give you show how an orientation that focuses on we, the community, correlates more with peace and justice. Think about the advent of Social Security, Medicare, the passing of civil rights legislation, the progress of Blacks. In contrast, the I orientation, according to a New York Times opinion piece, started with the Reagan administration and has led to income inequality, more open racism, and eventually the election of Trump. Here's another personal example of the we orientation to work toward peace and justice. When I retired, I decided to be a reading buddy at Cunningham Elementary School in Waterloo, where a friend of mine taught. The first year I read once a week with students in first grade, and the next 2 years I read with third graders. Cunningham is a school like several in Waterloo with a high percentage of students on free and reduced lunch. By choosing Cunningham, I hope to be closer to a space where I would learn more about the intersection between justice and peace. Until the pandemic, when I read with students, the teacher provided some guidance, and that was very helpful, but mostly I listened and learned. It's great to hang out with young people. I loved it. I can't wait for the pandemic to end and let me return. My idea was to help the students learn to read a little better, not to judge, not to change anything, but to be there, to be part of that community. As Weiner wrote, Jesus understood that what ultimately changes people's lives are relationships rather than rule books, mercy rather than moral demands. About 5 years ago, I got an opportunity to be part of another diverse community organization. This time it was Youth Art Team. I met Heidi Footman, the creative and executive director, when she was a UNI undergraduate graphic design student, and I was writing publications for the UNI College of Education. That was many years ago, and we connected several years ago, and I learned she had started the Youth Art Team a few years before that for a small group of students who were her own kids, a few of her children's Waterloo friends from a Waterloo school. It grew gradually into a diverse group of students from various ethnic and economic backgrounds who worked together to make large-scale art projects for the community. Youth Art Team is first and foremost built on relationships. I've heard Heidi say so many times that the focus is on the student artists, on having their voices direct the projects, and on meeting their needs, whatever they are. Meals when a grandparent dies, delivering art supplies during the pandemic, making weekly Zoom calls with students to hear how their school day went, supporting families when a parent is sick, or before the pandemic, giving student artists rides to and from the Youth Art Team headquarters building for open studio time. Youth Art Team is one more example of building relationships, building community, building that inclusive radicalism that can bring peace and justice for the common good. Youth Art Team works directly on the we of community. As I mentioned, research shows that focusing on we instead of I tends to build stronger social peace and justice. The results of Youth Art Team's focus on we, the community, have been amazing projects like the most recent mural titled Our Freedom Story along the Cedar River by the Waterloo Center for the Arts and the Phelps Youth Pavilion. The mural tells the stories and emotions of civil rights in Waterloo during the 1960s and 1970s. The student artists listened to stories from people who lived in those times and then drew what they heard and understood using lines, shapes, and colors. So much to learn, so many stories to hear, so many ways to be inclusive to search for peace and justice. The idea of living your values in relation to peace and justice surfaced more recently for me in a conversation the Waterloo Human Rights Commission sponsored with Nicole Hannah-Jones. She's a New York Times Magazine writer, creator of the Times 1619 project, Pulitzer Prize winner for that project, and a Waterloo native. One of the local people in the Zoom conversation that the Waterloo Human Rights Commission had with Hannah Jones asked her for ideas of what to do to improve education, housing, and wages in the Cedar Valley. She said, "You know what to do, live the values. Put the same amount of resources into doing something right as you were putting into undoing it. For example, does Waterloo have a desegregation plan? Put resources into education. Cedar Falls does not want to welcome Blacks? Put resources into that." It sounds so simple when she says that, and I think she's asking us again to focus on solutions that emphasize we instead of I. So I ask, where could we, this congregation, begin to work on that? Could our congregation help things move in that direction? I know there are others in the Cedar Valley who want to work on it. Could we join forces with them? I also humbly offer another way our congregation could live our values. We could pay reparations. We don't need to wait for someone to give us permission. Several people in this congregation know individuals, organizations that could help us direct some of our finances, perhaps a fifth Sunday offering to Blacks in our community who would welcome reparations. We are all complicit in racism, whether we were or are directly involved or not, in this country founded on slavery, founded on racism. Could Cedar Falls Mennonite Church do this? Why not? What a bold public statement for a church rooted in peace, justice, and nonviolence. It could challenge other churches and organizations to do the same. I want to end with another quote from Peter Wehner's article on a radical, inclusive Jesus, who is one of our sources on how to live a peaceful, just, nonviolent life. Quote, "Jesus' teachings are so challenging, so distinct from normal human reactions and behaviors that we constantly have to renew our commitment to them. Every generation of Christians need to think through how his example applies to the times in which they live. We need our sensibilities to align more with his. Otherwise, we drift into self-righteousness and legalism, even to the point that we corrupt the very institution, the church, which was created to worship him and love others. The lesson from Jesus' life and ministry is that understanding people's stories and struggles requires much more time and effort than condemning them, but it is vastly more rewarding."